It begins long before you notice it, not with a revelation, not with a breakthrough, but with a subtle disturbance in the rhythm of your life, a softness in your chest, a heaviness in your thoughts, a quiet feeling that something unseen is tugging at the edges of your awareness. For years, you've learned how to function in a world that never slows down. You move through routines, conversations, responsibilities, and expectations so automatically that you forget there was ever a time when you questioned any of it. You wake up, you move, you think, you act all inside a system of momentum that rarely gives you permission to pause. And in the middle of all that motion, something small begins to call your name. Not loudly, not urgently, but consistently, a soft whisper beneath the noise of your thoughts, a faint truth beneath the weight of your distractions, a sensation that feels less like a message and more like a memory. At first, you dismiss it. You tell yourself it's stress. You convince yourself it's nothing. You drown it out with entertainment, conversations, habits, or the next task on your list. The world is loud after all, and you've been taught to match that volume just to keep up. But the whisper doesn't go away. In fact, it grows stronger the longer you ignore it, not louder, deeper. The kind of depth that reaches into places inside you that you haven't visited in years. Maybe it starts while you're alone in your room. Maybe it appears during a sleepless night. Maybe it hits you in the middle of a normal day when everything looks the same but feels different. Something inside you shifts. An inner tension rises, not painful, but meaningful. It feels like your soul is clearing its throat, preparing to speak after years of silence. You begin to sense that what you've been calling discomfort is actually something else. A signal, a reminder, a tap on the shoulder from the part of you that refuses to disappear no matter how buried it becomes. The world around you hasn't changed, but your perception has. You start noticing the noise, the expectations, the busyness, the constant pressure to stay distracted. Noise that once felt normal now feels exhausting. Noise you didn't even know you were carrying. And beneath that noise, there it is again, that soft, persistent presence, the quiet voice you've avoided, not because it scares you, but because it tells the truth. It doesn't demand, it doesn't judge, it simply waits. It waits for the moment when your awareness finally turns inward. When your distractions collapse under their own weight, when you no longer want to outrun yourself, and suddenly you hear it clearly, calmly, undeniably, not in words, but in knowing, not as noise, but as truth. A truth that feels like something you've known forever, but only now. Remember, I am still here, and it's time to listen. The whisper beneath the noise has finally found you because you've finally become quiet enough to hear it. There comes a point in your life when you look at yourself and realize you've become someone you never consciously chose to be, not because you made the wrong decisions, not because you failed, but because somewhere along the way, you learned to shrink yourself so the world could feel comfortable around you. And for the longest time, you didn't notice. You were too busy surviving, adapting, pleasing, performing, doing what you thought you had to do just to belong. As you move through life, the world teaches you its rules without ever speaking them aloud. It teaches you who you should be, how you should act, what you should fear, what you should want, and without realizing it, you shape yourself around those expectations like clay pressed into a mold that was never designed for you. You start wearing identities that feel familiar but not truthful. You learn to smile when you're tired. You learn to stay silent when something inside you wants to scream. You learn to act stronger than you feel, even when your heart is breaking. You learn to be what others need, even if it means abandoning what you need. And slowly, without noticing, you drift away from yourself. You forget the child you once were, curious, fearless, honest, unfiltered. You forget the dreams you once carried like precious treasures. You forget your own voice, replacing it with the voices of those who told you who they thought you should become. At first, this new identity feels normal. Then it feels familiar. Then it becomes automatic. It becomes you, or at least the version of you that the world trained you to be. But awareness changes everything. When your inner voice begins to rise, you start to see the cracks in the identity you've been wearing. You notice how heavy it feels to pretend. You notice how exhausting it is to keep up appearances. You notice how unnatural it feels to shrink yourself just to meet expectations that were never yours. It's like waking up inside a house you've lived in for years and suddenly realizing the furniture isn't yours, the colors aren't yours, the walls aren't yours. You simply learn to live with them. That realization is painful. But it is also liberating, because once you see that the identity you've been living isn't your true one, something inside you begins to shift. You start questioning everything you once accepted. You begin to wonder who you might be without the fear, the conditioning, the expectations. You start sensing a version of yourself beneath the layers, a version that feels more real, more honest, more you. This is the moment your inner voice becomes louder. Not because it changed, but because you did. You finally created enough space inside yourself to hear the truth beneath the identity you've outgrown. You are not who the world told you to be. You are who you've always been beneath the noise. And now that real self is stepping forward. The moment your true self begins to rise, something else rises with it: fear. Not the kind of fear that makes your heart race or your hands shake, but a quieter, more familiar fear. A fear that lives inside your thoughts, shaped by every moment you doubted yourself, every person who underestimated you, every situation that taught you to stay small for your own safety. This fear doesn't shout, it whispers. It sounds logical, reasonable, protective. It pretends to be your friend. Be careful. Don't risk it. What if you fail? What will people think? Stay where you are, it's safer. Fear speaks quickly, loudly, confidently. Your inner voice, however, speaks softly, almost too softly to notice. And that is where the battle begins. Inside you, there are two forces trying to guide your life. One wants to keep you safe. The other wants to make you whole. Your inner voice calls you toward growth, honesty, authenticity, truth. Your inner fear pulls you backward toward familiarity, comfort, and the identities you've already outgrown. For years, fear has been winning, not because it is stronger, but because it screams while your intuition whispers. Fear has history backing it up. It remembers every mistake. It holds every painful memory. It stores every moment you felt rejected, embarrassed, or unworthy, then uses those moments as evidence for why you should never try again. Your inner voice, however, holds something deeper. Not memories, not wounds, but truth. Truth doesn't argue. Truth doesn't force. Truth doesn't scare. Truth simply waits. And now that your awareness has started to expand, you can finally feel the difference between the two. Fear feels tense, tight, urgent, like it wants to trap you in a version of yourself that no longer fits. Your inner voice feels calm, steady, patient, like it knows something fear doesn't. Fear tries to protect the identity you learned. Your inner voice tries to uncover the identity you lost. Fear tells you who you shouldn't be. Your inner voice reminds you who you already are. And the more you listen inward, the more you notice the pattern. Fear always speaks first. Intuition always speaks last. One is loud, the other is wise. There is a moment, subtle but life-changing, where you start watching your thoughts instead of obeying them. You hear fear's warnings, but you don't collapse under them. You feel its panic, but you don't let it control your decisions. You notice how predictable fear is and how honest your inner voice has always been. This is the turning point. The battle isn't about eliminating fear. It's about recognizing that the loudest voice inside you is not always the truest one. And once you realize that, fear begins to lose its power. Your intuition begins to rise, and the real you, the one buried beneath years of conditioning, begins to breathe again. The battle within you isn't a sign of weakness. It's proof that your awakening has begun. There comes a moment in your awakening when the truth you've avoided for years suddenly stands in front of you, not as a whisper, not as a hint, but as a presence you can no longer brush aside. It doesn't arrive with drama. It doesn't crash into your life. Instead, it appears in a moment so ordinary that you almost miss it. A breath, a pause, a thought that lands differently than it ever has before. And in that moment, something shifts. It feels like the world freezes for a second, not physically, but internally. Your thoughts slow down. Your emotions become louder. Your awareness expands. And suddenly, everything you've been running from rises to the surface at once. The exhaustion you ignored, the dreams you abandoned, the emotions you numbed, the truths you hid even from yourself. For so long, you convinced yourself you were fine. You kept moving, kept pretending, kept pushing through. You told yourself you didn't have time to feel. You told yourself it wasn't important. You told yourself you would deal with it later. But later has finally arrived, and it shows up in a way you can't escape. A feeling in your body, a sudden clarity in your mind, a heaviness in your chest that isn't pain, it's honesty. You start noticing everything you once overlooked. The way certain conversations drain you, the way certain environments numb your spirit, the way certain habits keep you stuck, the way certain people silence your truth. You've ignored these signals for years, maybe even decades. But when awakening begins, your inner world refuses to stay quiet. Your emotions, the ones you push down, rise like waves that have been gathering strength in the dark. Your intuition, once a whisper, becomes a guiding pull. Your awareness, once clouded, becomes sharp enough to cut through illusion. It's overwhelming at first, like turning on a light in a room you didn't know was messy, like seeing yourself clearly for the first time, like realizing how many parts of your life were built on compromises you didn't even notice you were making. And yet, this clarity is not punishment, it is liberation. Because clarity doesn't show you what's wrong. It shows you what is ready to change. You start to understand why you felt restless, why the old routines felt heavy, why you couldn't pretend anymore, why your inner voice kept calling you back. Everything you ignored becomes a map. Every discomfort becomes a message. Every realization becomes a doorway. This is the moment where your old life begins to crumble, not because you failed, but because you've outgrown it. And the truth that rises now isn't here to hurt you. It's here to free you. You finally see yourself without filters, without roles, without the expectations you once mistook for identity. This is clarity. This is awakening. This is the moment you can no longer go back. Not because you're trapped, but because you've finally opened your eyes. When the fog of your old life begins to lift, something extraordinary happens, not outside of you, but within you. A presence awakens, one that feels familiar in a way nothing else does. It doesn't enter with force. It doesn't demand your attention. It rises quietly, like a memory returning after years of being forgotten. And suddenly you realize you are meeting yourself again. Not the self you show to the world. Not the self built from fear, expectations, or survival, but the self you were before all of that. This inner reunion doesn't come as a single moment. It comes in waves. A moment of honesty here, a spark of courage there, a feeling of clarity that appears when you least expect it. For years, you abandoned this part of you without knowing it. You silenced it to fit in. You ignored it to avoid conflict. You buried it to feel accepted. And the world applauded your adaptation, not realizing the cost. But your true self never died. It simply waited. Waited for the day when the noise of the world grew too loud for you to bear. Waited for the moment when the identity you created felt too small. Waited for the silence where your inner voice could finally be heard. And now it steps forward. You begin to feel emotions you haven't allowed yourself to feel in years. Not sadness, not anger, but something much deeper recognition, a recognition of the dreams you let slip away, a recognition of the strength you forgot you carried, and a recognition of the person you once were before fear taught you to shrink. Your real self doesn't judge you for leaving. It welcomes you back. It understands why you had to create masks. It understands why you had to adapt. It understands why you hid parts of yourself just to survive the chapters of your life that felt too heavy to face fully. And now, in this moment of awakening, it offers you something you thought you lost forever: wholeness. You feel it in the way you speak more honestly. In the way you no longer force yourself to stay where your soul feels unseen. In the way you remember who you were before the world told you who to be. Reuniting with your true self is not peaceful. At first, it's emotional. It brings gratitude. It brings grief. It brings relief. Because this reunion reveals the truth. You were never broken. You were only disconnected. As you reconnect, something begins to heal inside you, not through effort, but through recognition. Not by fixing yourself, but by remembering yourself. You start choosing based on intuition instead of fear. You start listening instead of suppressing. You start becoming instead of performing. And slowly, beautifully, quietly, you step back into alignment with the person you were always meant to be. This is not a return to the past. This is a return to your essence. The self you abandoned has been waiting with open arms. And now, finally, you are home. There comes a moment in every awakening where you feel the shift, not just in your mind, but in your entire being. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's not something the world can see from the outside. But inside you, something irreversible happens. A line is crossed. A door opens. A truth settles into your bones so deeply that you can never return to who you were before. It happens quietly, almost unexpectedly. You breathe a little deeper. You stand a little taller. You speak with a little more truth. You notice when something feels wrong, and this time you don't ignore it. You notice when something feels real, and this time you don't run from it. You begin to see life not as something happening to you, but something being created from you. The old patterns lose their grip. The old roles feel too small. The old fears begin to sound like distant echoes. And the version of yourself that once controlled everything, the one built on survival, silence, and self-doubt, starts to fade like a shadow at sunrise. You realize that nothing outside of you changed, yet everything inside of you is different. You no longer move through life trying to please those who never understood you. You no longer betray your own voice just to avoid discomfort. You no longer shrink yourself to keep peace with environments your soul has already outgrown. You feel something new rising inside you, not confidence, not arrogance, but alignment. Alignment with your truth, alignment with your intuition, alignment with the life that always belonged to you but was waiting for you to be ready. This shift is gentle but powerful. It doesn't demand anything. It simply invites you to step forward. And as you do, you notice doors opening, not because they weren't there before, but because you couldn't see them while living inside your old identity. You start making choices that feel like truth instead of obligation. You say no without guilt and yes without fear. You protect your energy. You honor your intuition. You trust the part of you that speaks in knowing rather than noise. This is what it means to awaken, not to become someone new, but to finally become yourself. Every step you take now feels different, lighter, clearer, more intentional. You are no longer surviving your life, you are living it. You are no longer following the script handed to you, you are writing your own. And this time, you're listening to the voice inside you, the one you abandoned, the one you doubted, the one that never disappeared, the one that led you home. Your journey doesn't end here. This is only the beginning. From this moment forward, every choice you make comes from awareness instead of fear, from truth instead of habit, from who you truly are instead of who you were told to be. You are awake now. You are aligned now. You are ready now. Subscribe to watch more videos.